So today's agenda, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of web parts. Again, this is a fairly beginner course, just an overview of what web parts are and what you can do with them out of the box. We'll go over lots of examples and best practices along the way. And we're going to talk about what web part connections are, and even we'll talk a little bit about the data view web part, which is not as useful in 2013 since Microsoft removed the design view from SharePoint Designer. But we'll mention that, and I'll mention a couple of things you can still do with it. All right, so what are web parts? Here are a few quick examples of web parts. They're modular. They are, when you're looking at a page in SharePoint, there are the little rectangles that you can add to the page and rearrange and make them show you business data. People call these pages dashboards sometimes because you're just displaying the most important relevant information to your users. They're modular. There are about 70 of them. Again, SharePoint Enterprise version or E3 and up. And of course, like I mentioned, they are in Office 365 in the cloud. And a lot of them can even be connected to each other to allow filtering and to pass parameters back and forth. And so if you're a developer or whatever your role is in SharePoint, I encourage you to learn and understand the out-of-the-box web parts before you start writing custom code. So if the business comes to you and says they have this specific requirement to do a roll-up of this or that, and it needs to look a certain way, go ahead and research and understand what's already there out of the box, because you don't want to reinvent the wheel and reinvent something that already exists in SharePoint. All right, so all these words on the screen, these are the categories that web parts fall into. Some of them seem a little arbitrary. Microsoft has put them in these categories, so some of them don't even make sense in some cases. But as I go through the slides today, that is how I've organized them. I've organized them by the category that they're in the interface in SharePoint. All right, so our first category is called Content Rollup. So we have the good old content query web part that's been around since SharePoint 2007. That's a roll-up. We have a couple of new ones. We have Project Summary, which is like a little timeline that's sort of interactive. It goes back and forth between a couple of different screens that lets you look. Basically, it lets you point to a task list, and it shows those tasks on a timeline. Another interesting roll-up it's been around a while, but it's very useful, is Relevant Documents. This is a web part that you can put on a home page, and it will just show the current user documents that are relevant to them, documents that they've been using recently or that they've created recently from any document library in that whole site. And then the Content Search web part is awesome and new. So what's the difference between Content Query and Content Search? The Content Query web part is actually a bit more inefficient, because when it lets you do great roll-ups of content across sites in your site collection, but unfortunately, when each user hits the page, and the Content Query web part actually does the query right then. So the more content you're querying, the more information you're rolling up, the page will actually get slower and slower, and it could take quite a few seconds for it to load, diminishing the end user experience. So the Content Search web part, what's great about it is it's a roll-up like the Content Query, but the information's already there. It's already been crawled with SharePoint Search. So all you have to do is define what the data is that you want to roll up, and then there are a couple of different options about how you want it to look in the web part, and there are a million different possibilities. So again, my blog is wonderlaura.com. I've written a couple of different blog posts about the Content Search web part, and I'll go ahead and do a demo of that one. All right, so I'm going to go over to I've got my virtual environment here, my virtual machine, and I'll go ahead and add a Content Search web part to my home page, and then I'll show you another example of a Content Search web part that I customized a little bit. We'll give you the experience of what it looks like when you first add it to a page. So hopefully my virtual machine's cooperating, and it's just going to take a second. All right, let me go back over here and show, so it is working. So real quick, this is an example of something that's highly customized with a content search web part that's showing a roll-up of a bunch of documents with dates and who last worked on those documents. So let's go ahead and go add a new web part and go through that. All right, when you insert a web part on a page, and so this is the category we're in, content roll-up. Content search is right here. Also, you have a whole search-driven content category down here with a lot more specific looking web parts. These are all using the content search web part, but these are pre-configured to just basically to give you some ideas about some specific things that you can show in that web part. When you go to content roll-up and insert a content search web part, you are pretty much starting from scratch, and you can configure it however you'd like. So I will go ahead and add that to the page. By default, it shows me a handful of items, and I will immediately go and edit the web part. The first thing I'm going to do is figure out what the data is that I want to roll up. There are some very simple examples that it gives you in here, but again, there are a million things you could pick from in here and customize and tweak the way you would like. First of all, we can look for just a generic query that they have in here for us, such as documents, items of a certain content type, items matching a tag, items having to do with the current user, videos, etc. Think about some of these, and when you think about some of these categories like a content type, and you're building out business solutions, just remember that content types and tags and things are very powerful when it comes to doing roll-ups. So as you're first developing just any solutions in SharePoint, you might want to take these types of things and these sort of options that you have in this web part into consideration and maybe use content types where you might not have. For example, I have a content type in my demo environment here called policies. So I could, well, I have a tag called policy, and I also have a content type called policy. So those are a couple of different options you have. So I could pick a specific content type called Contoso policy like this, and I know that every time anyone in my SharePoint environment has created a company policy, I've enforced them to use this specific content type. So again, that's a good way that you can use those to roll up. So I'm giving you really sort of a best practices overview of things to know about the content that's being rolled up so that you'll be able to use it the most efficiently. So then again, there's another option to where I could have a tag. So maybe I'm not using content types, or maybe I am, but I'm encouraging people to tag all the company policies with specific metadata that says policy. Therefore, I can roll up my content that way. So that's just one example. I'll go ahead and use policy, things that are tagged with policy as an example, and I'll go through a couple of these other screens. So as you can see, though, as I pick things and narrow it down, it actually shows me the real results on the page as I'm going. So I'm not flying blind. I can tell what kind of data I'm going to see. So I can go to refiners here, and it gives me a lot of different things. Now, this is similar. The refiners are a similar concept you might see when you're doing a search in SharePoint, and you see the refiners down the left side of the page, things that you can narrow it down by. Or if you're on eBay or Amazon and you're shopping, refiners are what you're narrowing down. So these are refiners if I want to have more specific items in my list and narrow it down a little bit. So I can have people, content types, a certain site, tags, etc. And then my settings, these are a little bit more advanced options. Whether you have query rules in your environment or not, that's a whole other level. That's way more advanced of a search concept. But and then I have test, which if I'm into this type of thing, looking at the keyword query syntax, I can actually see what the syntax is that would be used to find these exact same results. And this looks like this is the GUID, the unique ID of that specific metadata that I chose. So I'll go ahead and click OK. And here's some other options. I can say how many company policies maybe that I want to be displayed here, maybe 15 at a time. And then you don't get many options for how you want things to be displayed in one of these web parts, unfortunately. So list is a good one, and you'll see a lot of these in here. All these ones that start with modern, I was testing something and playing around with different things. But it only comes with, say, 4 or 5 of each of these, and it's not gorgeous and fancy. So that's sort of one of the negatives to the content search web part, is if you're a business user and you're not a developer and you like to just use all the out-of-the-box functionality, this web part kind of looks ugly in a way. But if you do know someone that's a developer, there is you can write some CSS and JavaScript to create what's called your own display template to make it look a little nicer. So here's what I did. I went ahead and let's save it and see what it looks like. Okay, so now I have basically a big long list of company policies that's a little ugly. So there are a couple of additional things that I can do to change the way it looks. At least I have a nice pretty icon of what type of document it is. I'll go back into the settings and I can define a little bit more specifics. So right now I have it displaying the title of the item, but it gives me a line too, which will let me go define what I want to show in addition. So maybe not just the title, but maybe a description or an author, etc. So I'll put author in here, and just like any web part, I can give it a title. So this is the title, which is going to show at the top of my web part, telling everyone what the heck this is a list of. So I can call this recent company policies, or popular company policies, whatever I define there. And then by default, this web part does not have any kind of border around it. It was just plain white on a white background. So I went ahead and chose a Chrome type of title and border. And that's just a generic setting that exists in all web parts. So at least it's now it's still kind of ugly, but it gives me a little bit more information. So I can play around with a lot of that metadata. Another important thing to know about some of this metadata, you saw the drop-down box where I could choose which fields I wanted to display here. It's always a good idea when you're doing something like this, especially company policies that might be site collection-wide or enterprise-wide, use site columns instead of just creating columns directly inside of a list or library, because when you use site columns, you will actually be able to utilize those inside of this content search web part and even a content query web part to be able to narrow things down, have filters and additional information, etc. So I'll show you a couple of other options in here. I'll go back to the query page. Let's see. All right, let's change query again. Okay, so here again, I've got advanced mode. So advanced mode gives me more of a raw information about what I'm doing in here. So I can change, say I can just completely delete this. When I do, now I don't have anything specific. I can say, what if I only want to return sites? So I'll say only return sites, and when I add that, it actually shows me what the syntax is for returning sites. And then maybe I want to say content type equals, and I can pick a specific content type, etc. So I'll go ahead and say only show me sites, and then I'll test that. And I'm going to go look at refiners. What if I want to only see a specific type of site? Look at this. Now that I've chosen to only show sites, my refiners have a little bit more specific information in them relative to what I've selected already. So now I can say I want to only show project sites. So now what if I just want to have a web part that shows me every project site that anyone has created in my environment and just shows me all the projects? Remember, this is security trimmed. Just like everything in search, users aren't going to find things that they don't have permissions to. Everything people are looking at in this content search web part is automatically security trimmed. So if you, the IT person, you see a whole bunch of things in here and it concerns you, don't worry, the end users are only going to see the sites that they have access to. So let's see, I still have just a list, but now when I click OK, it's, as you can tell, this web part's very powerful, and I could probably spend a whole hour on just this web part. So now I'm showing, it's just showing me sites, and I could call this popular project sites, right? Okay, so I'll show you one more specific one. I'm not a developer. I don't write code. I don't know anything about it, so this took me a really long time. But I created a custom display template, just kind of using what I saw that was already in there and looking at the HTML code and trying to guess. And because this is a common requirement that I get, people want the content search web part to not be so ugly. They just want it to look like a document library. That's how people are used to seeing documents in SharePoint, right? So I tried to do one that looks more like a document library. So that's just an example of how you can customize one of these. And developers have done really cool things with these. And again, they're called display templates. All right, do you have any questions about the content search web part? Anyone? Feel free to ask questions as we go. I like to have that kind of environment where you can, talk about whatever happens to be on the screen at that time. So feel free to raise your hand. Okay, I'll go ahead and move on. I wouldn't be surprised if there's an entire session somewhere at this conference on just the content search web part. There probably is. Okay, so the next category we get to is business data. So these have actually been around a while. The Excel Web Access web part lets you display a spreadsheet right there inside of a web part for everyone to see. It gives you options such as if you want to display a specific named item in the spreadsheet. You can even get fancy and pass parameters to it from other web parts. But just keep in mind that a lot of the times what people want to do is they want to display information, not let people edit it, and not let people even have access to wherever that spreadsheet lives, whatever library it's in. They don't want people to even go there. There's a custom permission level called Excel Services Viewers. And Excel Services Viewers is what's going to allow you to lock that down, only give them Excel Services Viewers access to this, and then the end users will not be able to go edit the spreadsheet. They'll really just only be able to view it in the web part. And this web part goes across the whole site collection. So I can display an Excel spreadsheet on one site that actually lives in a document library in another site. The Visio Web Access, not many people seem to use Visio from what I can tell, but this is a really powerful web part because it lets you display any Visio Web Access diagram that's in a library right here in a web part. And it's interactive, and it even lets people make comments directly in the Visio, and then you can even do web part connections to it. So just a quick example would be having your office diagram built up in Visio and putting connections to it so that when you click someone's desk, it filters another SharePoint list to show that specific person's name and phone number and that filtered information about them. All right, so, and I might demonstrate the Excel Web Access web part if we have time at the end. I just didn't necessarily put that in here as one of the demos, just because a lot of the time I get a lot of people saying that they've seen it because it's been around since SharePoint 2007. Filter web parts. They have actually been around since SharePoint 2007, but I don't think enough people know about these. They're very powerful. You can do a lot of neat things with them, building your business solutions. A lot of the times when you see these and you start putting them on web pages, it doesn't make much sense because they don't really do anything when you put a filter web part on a page by itself. So it actually has to be connected to another web part in order to do something. So these are SharePoint Enterprise. They require connections to other web parts. The provider web part sends data to the consumer web part. That's how our web part connections are going to work. And again, they've been around since SharePoint 2007. Here's an example. I have 3 SharePoint lists: promoted links, important tasks, and policies. I've placed them all in web parts on the home page, and I also placed a current user filter, one of the filter web parts, on the page. So when you use the current user filter, it lets you define a specific user property of whoever happens to be looking at the page. So you can look at their name, you can look at what department they're in, you can look at the name of their office. All those properties that come over from Active Directory with your user profile, you can choose those and use them in this web part. So a really common one is just looking at the user's name, but here's one where I'm looking at the current user's department. So whatever department that person is in, it's filtering these other 3 web parts to show specific information regarding that department. So these policies, see the custom column over there called Contoso Department? That is a site column that I've added to all these different lists. So it automatically filters Contoso Department by that specific department in all of the web parts. And so when an end user is looking at the page, this is what they see. They don't see the current user filter web part. It's just running behind the scenes. They just see the data that's relevant to them. I'll go ahead and demonstrate how to build that. And I have that on my home page here. So I will, let's see, back to home. All right, so I'll delete the content search web part here. Okay, so I'll show you what the lists are and what they look like. Policies, company policies, and again, one of the columns here is called Contoso Department. Can you see that okay in the back? Okay, so I have Contoso Department here. And again, I created that as a site column in site settings and added the same site column to these different lists. I have important tasks, and then I have added Contoso Department here, and I have assigned each task to be related to a department. And then I have, this is a fairly new web part in SharePoint 2013. It's the promoted links list. Promoted links are just a bunch of hyperlinks. The confusing thing about this type of list is that when you go to the list, it's not apparent how to edit the list. So there's an out-of-the-box view that you need to go to in the list tab, all promoted links, and there. Now it actually looks like a list. It's just a list of hyperlinks. So what I've done is I've added that Contoso Department site column to this list as well. So that way I can target my pretty little announcements, pretty little tiles to whoever happens to be looking at the page. All right, so when I go to the home page, I'm going to create a new page and do this from scratch so you can see how this is built. So I'll go ahead and do add a page, test, current user, so that you can see it empty and see how they work. All right, I think it's creating the page. There we go. All right. Insert. So first I will insert the important tasks, and then I'll insert the promoted links, and then the policies. Now, one little trick, it's sort of a bug, a trick to the task lists in SharePoint 2013. The bug is that by default, it shows this pretty little timeline on top of your tasks, but when you have this timeline, it doesn't let you do web part connections to it. I don't know if anybody's noticed that before, but if I create a different view and in my list and I don't use that, I just called it old school. I just created a view that had a different style other than the default style. And you create a view that doesn't use the new default style in SharePoint, in this new version of SharePoint 2013, then it will allow you to do connections to it. So that was just sort of a little quick tip about something you might come across with those. All right, so now I'll insert the current user filter web part. All right, it's in the filters category, current user filter. And then once I insert the current user filter, you'll see this looks a little strange. Wiki pages do that. I usually prefer to use web part pages because they don't have such strange behavior. But if I go, here's another little weird bug and a tip. If I go to some other web part and I click Edit Web Part, all of a sudden my current user filter appears, and then I can go edit it. Has anybody come across that before with wiki pages? It's very odd. So here are my web part settings on the right. So by default, it's going to give me the current user's name, but again, I can choose from all these different properties from the user profile service about that current user. So I'll pick the department. So I am logged in as me, Laura Rogers, and the department that I'm in is information technology. So that is the data that's being stored in that web part when I hit that page. All right, so then I create my connections. So I can create a web part connection. I can start from the web part that I want to send the information from, or I can start from one of the consumer web parts. But I say send filter values to, and I just create 3 different connections. So I'll send it to policies. And it's very logical. I'm saying get the filter values. And then you simply have to match up the syntax of whatever the data is in the current user filter, like information technology. It has to match with what field. So in this case, it's going to be the Contoso department field, and that is the field that's going to say information technology. So now I've created the first connection. I'll go create the second connection to important tasks. And it slows down. There it goes. All right, get a filter value. And same thing, Contoso department. And then I'll go create one more, promoted links. So I don't even necessarily have to see the field that I'm filtering in the web part. I don't have to have that as a column. And it will still do the filtering. All right, so I've created all 3 connections, and now I think it's just a matter of, it would just be a matter of rearranging things on the page. But on the promoted links list, you notice when I looked at it that it had about 5 or 10 things in the list, and notice because I'm in information technology, it only shows the ones that were in information technology, and it only shows a handful of policies. So that's what the home page looks like. Does that seem pretty useful to be able to have very specific information targeted to people that way? The current user filter is great. The query string filter is also another really powerful one. Just a quick note, some colleagues and I at Rackspace do what's called a SharePoint Power Hour. It's just a free YouTube streaming thing that we do every Wednesday. And it's just an hour of demoing something. And I did a whole power hour on the filter web parts just recently. And I'll give you that link at the end of the slide deck. All right, so that was the filter web parts. Okay, next we have some social web parts. We have a news feed, which is fairly new in this current version of SharePoint. We have a tag cloud, and then we have promoted links. Now, promoted links, I'm referring to that as social collaboration because it's actually just a SharePoint list. But I was sure to include this in my slides because it seems like it's a web part. It's a very pretty web part. It's a very powerful one. And it shows, this modern interface with tiles that sort of flip when you hover over them. So everybody wants it. Everybody wants it on their home page. So even though it's not technically an out-of-the-box web part, it's just a list. It's just an app. I wanted to be sure and highlight it here. So again, newsfeed, tag cloud, and promoted links. The newsfeed is it's tied in with the SharePoint built-in newsfeed as opposed to Yammer. So if you're still on premises and you're using the built-in social components in SharePoint, who's on premises? A lot of people, good, okay. So if you're still using the built-in social, then the newsfeed is going to be great for having a conversation. Every team site is going to have this as part of the team site when you first create one, and it's just for people to have a quick conversation about that team, that project, whatever it happens to be. And it's also tied in with your My Sites. When people go to their news feed, it's all tied in with the main news feed. The tag cloud web part, again, is if you're using tags. So I mentioned earlier Tagging all the company policies with the word policy. Those are the enterprise keywords. Tagging can be very powerful because of all the things that we can do with roll-ups and the tag cloud and having things show in the content search web part with search, etc. So I highly recommend that you use tags. The quickest way to be able to use tags is just in your settings for any list or library. There's an enterprise keywords setting that you can click on, and you just check a couple of boxes to turn it on. So once you turn it on, that gives people the ability to tag things just quickly in that list or library. So that's just sort of the basic quick way to have that up and running so that you're encouraging your end users to put keywords on things. All right, I'll go ahead and do a demo of promoted links. I showed you what it looked like very quickly, but I'll go ahead into a demonstration. I'll go to Human Resources, and I have several HR benefits. So this is a promoted links list. So to create this, I choose Add an App, and promoted links list is just one of the types of lists I can choose from here, right here. And then it looks like it's a SharePoint list. The tricky thing is you have to go to the All Promoted Links view to be able to actually edit these and do anything with them and see what the data is in them. So I'll show you what it looks like. So I'll say, what is my new link going to do? It's going to go to Bing. I'll just do this as an external one. And it can be any URL. So what you need is a title and description. This goes to Bing. And then for link location, that's just what the URL is. So if it's going to be something in SharePoint, you need to go to that list or library and go find out, go copy the URL to be able to use it here. So that's one of the things that you have to know to do ahead of time if it's SharePoint content you want to point to. And then you can say whether it opens in a new tab, etc. The dialog box is powerful because that would open it up like in a little form right in front of the page that you're on. And then you can even say what order you want it to show in. All right, so the background image is a separate thing. So you actually have to know where an image is that you want to use as the image that shows when people hover over it. So I have a little collection of images here I just have at the top level here, I have some images in my site collection images. So I can go pick an image of Bing here, my little Bing icon, and I have to know how to copy that. So some of these things that you're doing with the promoted links list are very complicated to an end user, right? End users don't necessarily know what a URL is or how to go get it or how some of these things, and to people that have been using SharePoint for a while, a lot of it seems pretty simple, but it's a lot of steps to do these promoted links in some cases. So I'll go ahead and go back to my page here and go to my benefit links. So now the one that I created here, I have to go back to the all promoted links and go back and edit it. And again, they don't give you an edit button. That's very obvious. You have to go to the ribbon to edit it. So it's like Microsoft made this as difficult as possible. All right. So now there's my Bing image. And now when I look, I'll just look at the default view of this. It's going to look like a little pretty tile. And when I hover over it, it has the little description that I typed. So again, these are very powerful to give your site that sort of wow factor to make it look modern. Yes? Does the web part resize the images for you? It actually will give you a square. It will just give you a square of whatever it happens to be. So like this one, it put sort of green around the edge because it didn't quite fit the square, but it's not going to ever show you a rectangular tile. It's always going to show a square of whatever you uploaded. All right, so those are the promoted links. We did a whole power hour on promoted links as well about custom things to do, like get rid of this little scrolling bar, etc. That involves JavaScript, by the way. All right. Okay, there are a couple of media and content web parts. Having videos in SharePoint is a very popular thing lately. People want to be able to show videos. You not only want to be able to show videos that are in SharePoint, a lot of the times they want to be able to show videos that are, say, on YouTube, and you might not want to store all of your videos inside of your SharePoint farm. So the media web part lets you quickly display a video that you can set to automatically play if you wanted to, and then the picture library slideshow, you point to a SharePoint picture library on your site and it will automatically scroll through the pictures. And regarding your question you asked about it resizing things, the picture library slideshow is actually one that would look kind of awkward because it's going to show the images sort of whatever they are, and it could change on the page as it scrolls through them. So that's one of those things where you might want to make sure ahead of time that all your images sort of have similar dimensions for that one. I'll go ahead and demonstrate that media web part. Now, a media web part is, you don't even actually have to have the media web part when you want to see it on a page. When you click the Insert tab, you actually have video and audio as one of the options right here on the Insert, on this drop-down. So as the media web part, it does exist as a web part, but you could just directly include it this way. So I can go to, let me see where I kept that one, IT projects. So I can go to my IT projects site and go to a specific video that I've put in here. I put it in my asset library and I'll pick that video. And then in the ribbon is where I can go, see there's a new media tab here. So when I select this web part or select this video, I have a media tab where I can go through here and change. I can change the default image, I can change whether it starts automatically, and I can even change some sizing here. So I can also, if you'll notice when I click Insert, I can embed. I can choose embed information. So embed is where you're going to be able to show something that exists on some other web page, YouTube, etc., that's not in SharePoint. And I actually have a whole slide about the embed code that I'll get to. All right, let's see. I'm going to skip the picture library slideshow. All right, embed code. So again, in the spirit of out-of-the-box web parts, embed code isn't necessarily a web part, but it is a way that you can insert things on a page. So you can insert videos using embed code from YouTube, and you can insert even just information about, or information that's in a Word document or a PowerPoint presentation. You can actually display a PowerPoint presentation as a web part on a page. So you have to have Office web apps. So if you're on premises, you actually have to have Office web apps installed in your farm. And if you're on Office 365, you will already have Office web apps. So this is what it would look like with, if you have Office web apps and you're looking at a document library, you can click the little ellipsis and you can see, this is where it would show your presentation that you're hovering over. And then when you click the little menu over here, that's where you can get the embed information. So it's a PowerPoint presentation in a library. You get the embed information. You don't have to know anything about the code. It's just code that you copy. And then I'll show you how you can insert that. So, and then if you're on YouTube and you go to the share button, embed is one of the options it gives you on YouTube to get the embed code. So this is just code. Again, you don't have to know how to be a programmer, but you just know how to copy that to the clipboard and be able to use that on your site. So I'll go ahead and show you that on my Office 365. We'll see how fast this is to get to my Office 365 site. Oh, that's not too bad. Okay, so when I go to my page, instead of clicking to insert a web part, I click to insert embed code. So whatever I just copied to the clipboard from a specific document or from a YouTube video, I simply paste it in here and it will even show me what it's going to look like in this little pane. And then, see, I've done this ahead of time. I've got a specific Word document over here and I've got a PowerPoint over here. And so that's how to insert snippets of code onto a page. Any questions about snippets of code? Good. All right. Okay. All right, so the data view web part, I was hoping I would have time to show you a little bit about this. Back in versions of SharePoint previous to SharePoint 2013, we had the ability with SharePoint Designer 2010, we were able to go in and open up a SharePoint list and change it a little bit and change the way it looked and do conditional formatting just very easily on the design view in SharePoint Designer. It was just what you see is what you get, and you can directly edit the way that list will look. In SharePoint Designer 2013, Microsoft removed that design tab. So you can still, I know, shaking your head. So you can still get to the code view, but you can't actually go in there and see what you're doing. You would have to know exactly where to go in the code to do it, unfortunately. So another option we have, and I wrote a blog post about this, is this thing called JS Link. Has anybody heard of this? There are actually 2 other sessions at this conference on JS Link. Again, I'm not a developer, but I think this is a very powerful thing to be able to delve into and learn a little bit about. It's just basically using some HTML code to define maybe some conditional formatting or define the way you want a certain column to look in your list. And if you'll notice in your web part properties, that little pane that I had on the right side of the screen, there is a new option under the miscellaneous section called JS Link. So you have to be able to reference a JavaScript, a JS file from there. But whatever web part, you know, your list view that you're rendering on the page will use that code that you wrote to say, you know, display any number over 50 shows as green, or any hyperlink is, you know, shows a certain way. So basically, again, you have to be a developer, so I can't really get into a demo on that, but it's definitely something to look into and to know that it exists, because it's another option for being able to customize what those lists look like. And then we have Flying Blind in SharePoint Designer 2013, which is basically, there are a couple of things that you can still do. So I have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and show you. Again, it's limited, but there are still a couple of things that you're going to be able to do in here. Now, I can go to SharePoint Designer, and I can go straight to Lists and Libraries. And when I open up a view, and now I mentioned earlier about this default view with the task list and the timeline versus all the other views. And you guys might have noticed this too if you started working with SharePoint 2013, is that there is a new way that all of your lists and libraries look, and it's just a style. So in your view settings for any list or library and all the list of styles you might have tried in the past, there is the default style that all of your lists and libraries get. But that is the only style really that they made for 2013. So if you switch your list to any of the other styles, you're going to actually lose some of the 2013 functionality, like your list of all of your views is going to disappear from the top of your library and things like that. But there is actually something that you can gain from that, in that you'll have the ability to do some things with it in SharePoint Designer. So in this project phase list, I have just as the default view. So if I just open a SharePoint default view in SharePoint Designer, it is very ugly. It doesn't tell me much, and there isn't really anything I can do with it. If I click in there, it doesn't give me anything in the menu to do, anything to do with data view web parts. But I'll go ahead and go over to this list, and I'm going to create a new view of it, and I'm not going to use the default style. Come on, machine. Let's see. All right. So I'll say create view, standard view, and I'll call this retro. And the trick is to simply go down to the styles and not use default. I'll just say basic table. So now, so let me show you the difference quickly. That my default view has this pretty little new item. It has all my views here. It has this nice little find an item box, which lets you very quickly find things in SharePoint 2013. When I create the view without the default, it looks a lot different. I lose a lot of information at the top. And so this might be a good type of view to show in a web part maybe. But if you use this type of view in a list, it's going to end up confusing some end users. But there's more that you can do with it when you do it this way. So I'll refresh in SharePoint Designer and go to my retro view. So for those of you who like to create custom business solutions and maybe do a little more with SharePoint and start doing some web part connections and things, look at this now. I've opened this web part, and look at that. I get my good old SharePoint, my data view web part options up at the top, even though I can't really see what the web part's going to look like. One of the common things that people do in custom business solutions with the data view web part is add parameters to it. So look at that. So that's at least one thing that I can still do with this web part, is I can go in here and add a parameter to it if I want to do something with it. I can also, so this is, to me, this is the most powerful. I can go into this web part and simply export it. So any list and library that you want to show on a different site in your site collection, you can still do that as long as you don't use the default style. So I can export this list to a file. I'll call it phases. When you export a web part from here, it gives it to you as a .webpart file. And then that .webpart file is something you can actually go to any page in SharePoint and import that onto it. So if I do this, if I have a custom solution where I need to have this list of project phases and then need to be able to have a parameter associated with it to be able to pass that, I can go in here and give it a parameter, export the web part, and go put it on that custom dashboard or wherever I need to use it. So I'll put this on my, is that a bit too much? I know I said this was an advanced class, but I figured I'd throw some of these things in at the end. Okay, so I'm going to call this phases, and I'll say, always show list data from the current, yes. You could do a relative one if you wanted to. Okay, so now my project phases actually existed on my home page and at my top level of my site collection. So I'll go ahead and, oh, come on. I think I'm confusing it. Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay. Go back to my site and leave the page. All right, so the key is I want to go to a different site in my site collection. One that the project phases is on the root level, I'll go to a different site. And when I insert a web part, one of the little options down here you might not have noticed is to upload a web part. So now that I have that .webpart file that I exported, I can actually upload that onto this page. So I saved it to my desktop. I saved it as a phases.webpart. And this exporting web parts is useful for other types of web parts. For example, the content search. If you have the content search web part looking just right how you want it, you can actually export that off of your page as well. So and then just go quickly use it somewhere else and not have to reconfigure it. Okay, so I think it's uploading. There we go. And now, of course, when you do this, it uploads and then it looks like it disappears and you have to click Insert again. And then click Save. And look at that. So now I'm showing a list from another site on a different site in the same site collection. Is that pretty powerful? You guys are hard to impress. So where people want to use the content search web part, a lot of times I point them to the content search web part to be able to use that to show information from other sites. Again, it's hard to get it to look the way you want. It doesn't look like a list or library. But if you just want to show the list or library just as it is on another site, here's a way that you can do it by using SharePoint Designer to export it and then import it.
But it has to be in the same site collection.
She said, does it have to be in the same site collection? Yes, because it uses that unique ID, that GUID, in behind the scenes. So it definitely, yes, it has to be in the same site collection. If you want to go across site collections, that's where the content search web part would be applicable, because that's across the whole farm. So you can show something from anywhere. And again, it's just security trimmed. All right. I'm going to go ahead and go through a couple more slides and then wrap it up. So I'll see if you guys have any questions in a minute. All right. So again, some more information. I've got a couple of other presentations tomorrow. I have creating an approval workflow. It's 2 parts. So part 1 is super basic beginner information about how to do just out-of-the-box approvals in SharePoint, like using built-in content approval, some out-of-the-box workflows, and some basic things like that for beginners. And then part 2 is advanced using SharePoint Designer workflows, and it's kind of a huge leap from the first one. So, and it gets pretty, you have to be familiar with SharePoint Designer workflows already to be able to follow that one. Again, I'm Wonder Laura on Twitter. We have a Rackspace booth here that I will be hanging out at. And again, my colleagues and I, this is free streaming on YouTube. This is our YouTube channel. And we use a Google Hangout, and we just do it so it's Wednesday, it's 11 Central where I live, but it's 5 p.m. here. So that's what time it would be. And then we have them all recorded. So we have about 78 of them in there in a playlist on our YouTube channel. And you can just sift through those, and we just demo all kinds of out-of-the-box business solutions, just no-code things that you can do in SharePoint. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming.